I've lived long enough to notice something about the people this world throws away. The ones nobody wants, nobody sees. Funny thing is, they're often the ones who end up mattering most. Not because they prove anything to anybody, but because when you've got nothing left, you find out what you're really made of. I saw that happen once, to a boy everyone had already forgotten. The lock clicked, then silence. Vincent stood on the back porch, his uncle's shadow already moving away from the window. No yelling, no argument. Just a door that wouldn't open anymore, and $5 pressed into his palm. Don't come back. 3 words. That was all. November wind cut through his thin jacket. Vincent looked down at the crumpled bill, his entire inheritance from a family that had decided he wasn't worth keeping. He didn't knock, didn't beg. He'd seen that look in his uncle's eyes before. The same look people gave stray dogs that wandered too close. The kind of look that said, "You don't belong here." Vincent turned and walked. Behind him, a light went off. Ahead of him, the road stretched into darkness. 3 days. That's how long a person could walk through a town without being seen. Vincent learned this the hard way standing outside the hardware store on Main Street, asking the owner if he needed help, sweeping, lifting, anything. The man looked him up and down, gray stubble, tobacco-stained fingers. "Whose kid are you?" Vincent opened his mouth, closed it. He thought about the church 2 blocks over, the sheriff's office on the corner, but he'd heard stories about boys like him, boys with no papers. No family to vouch for them. They ended up in group homes 3 counties away, or worse. Wards of the state, numbers in a file. Don't know. Then get going. The door swung shut. A bell jingled overhead. By afternoon, Vincent found himself behind the farmer's market, where vendors dumped what they couldn't sell: wilted cabbage leaves, bruised tomatoes soft enough to squeeze through his fingers. He stuffed what he could into his jacket pockets, the cold vegetable juice soaking through to his skin. A woman watched him from her stall. 60s, maybe. Flour dusted her apron. Vincent froze, waited for her to shout, to call him a thief. She turned back to her crates and kept stacking, like he wasn't there, like he was part of the garbage he was picking through. That was worse than yelling. Yelling meant someone saw you. Night came fast. The temperature dropped. Vincent huddled near the back wall of Murphy's bar, close enough to hear voices through the thin wood, but far enough to stay in shadow. 2 men, laughing. The clink of glasses. That old place on the edge. Garrett's been trying to dump it for years. The one with the caved-in roof. That's the one. Pile of junk. Couldn't give it away for $5. Laughter. More clinking. Vincent pressed his back against the cold wall. $5. He still had $5. Crumpled in his pocket. Damp from the cabbage juice. A pile of junk no one wanted. He pulled the bill out and looked at it under the weak light from the bar window. Lincoln's face stared back, worn and faded. $5 couldn't buy much, but maybe it could buy something everyone else had already thrown away. Vincent found it at the edge of town, past the last row of respectable houses, past the rusted mailboxes and overgrown yards. A dirt path led through waist-high weeds, and there, sitting like something the world had forgotten, was the house. Worse. It was worse than the men at the bar had described. The roof sagged in the middle, 3 separate holes visible even from 20 feet away. The walls, what remained of them, showed bare wood through peeling paint that might have once been white, but now looked like dirty snow. The front door hung crooked on one hinge, gap-toothed and tilted. Vincent walked closer. His shoes crunched on broken glass a window. Maybe, or several. He couldn't tell anymore what had shattered and what had simply rotted away. The porch steps groaned when he tested them with one foot. The second step had a hole straight through, black and soft around the edges. He skipped it and pressed his palm against the doorframe. The wood gave slightly under his fingers, spongy from years of rain, years. But the frame held. The walls stood, 4 of them, more or less, and the roof, despite the holes, was still a roof. Vincent's breath made small clouds in the cold morning air. He'd slept behind the bar again last night, curled against himself, waking every hour when the wind shifted. His fingers were stiff. His stomach had stopped growling 2 days ago, which worried him more than the hunger itself. He needed shelter, real shelter, before the snow came. Finding Mr. Garrett took another hour of asking around. The old man lived in a small yellow house 3 streets back from Maine, the kind of place with a sagging porch and empty beer bottles lined up on the railing. Vincent found him sitting in a plastic chair, a cigarette between his fingers, staring at nothing. Mr. Garrett, the old man turned, 70, maybe older. Deep lines carved into his face, eyes that had stopped caring about most things a long time ago. Who's asking? I heard you have a house. The one on the edge of town. Garrett took a long drag, let the smoke curl out through his nose. That pile of garbage. What about it? I want to buy it. For a moment, nothing. Then Garrett laughed a dry, rattling sound that turned into a cough. Buy it, kid. I've been trying to unload that thing for 6 years. Nobody wants it. Costs more to tear down than it's worth. County won't even take it for back taxes. Vincent reached into his pocket. His fingers found the bill still damp, still crumpled. He pulled it out and held it up. $5? Garrett stared at the money, then at Vincent, then back at the money. You serious? Yes, sir. No papers? I'm not filing anything with the county for $5. Not worth the fee. You want it? You take it. But don't come back asking me to sign anything. Handshake's fine. Garrett stood slowly, his knees cracking. He looked at Vincent, the way you'd look at a stray dog that wandered onto your property, not with cruelty, more like tired curiosity. Your funeral. Kid, whatever happens in there, it's your problem now, not mine. He took the $5, folded it once, slipped it into his shirt pocket. Then he stuck out his hand. Vincent shook it. The old man's palm was rough, calloused, surprisingly strong. It's yours. Don't say I didn't warn you. Behind them, someone laughed. Vincent turned. A man walking by, maybe 40, carrying a bag of groceries, had stopped to watch. The same man who'd been at the bar 2 nights ago. The one who'd called the place a pile of junk. Did you just sell that wreck to a kid? Garrett. For how much, fam? $5? More laughter. The man shook his head and kept walking, still chuckling. Good luck with that, son. You're gonna need it. Vincent watched him go, The laughter carried on the wind, mixing with the rustle of dead leaves. He didn't answer, didn't defend himself. What was there to say? The man was probably right. Everyone was probably right. But Vincent had learned something in the past week. Being right didn't matter when you were freezing. Being smart didn't matter when you had nowhere to sleep. What mattered was having something, anything that belonged to you. He walked back to the house. His house. The crooked door scraped against the warped floor. When he pushed it open, the smell hit him first: mold, dust, something animal that had probably died under the floorboards years ago. He breathed through his mouth and stepped inside. The floor creaked. One corner was black and soft, rotted through where rain had pooled. He avoided it, testing each step before putting down his full weight. The main room was bigger than he'd expected, maybe 15 feet by 20. A stone fireplace sat against the back wall, its chimney crumbling but intact. An old cast-iron stove squatted in the corner, rusted but solid. Someone had left a wooden chair with 3 legs leaning against the wall. Afternoon light poured through the holes in the roof, casting bright spots on the dusty floor. Vincent stood in the center of the room. Dust swirled around his ankles. Cold air pushed through gaps in the walls. Somewhere above, a bird had built a nest in the rafters. He could see dried grass poking out between 2 boards. It was falling apart. It was probably dangerous. It might collapse on him in his sleep, but it had 4 walls and something that resembled a roof and a door that closed mostly, and it was his. The first thing he owned since his parents died, the first space where no one could tell him to leave. Vincent lowered himself to the floor, his back against the wall, and looked up at the ruined ceiling. Through one of the holes, he could see a patch of gray sky, clouds moving fast, the smell of coming snow. He had no tools, no materials, no money left, no food for tomorrow, and winter was 3 weeks away at most. He didn't know where to begin, but as he sat there, the cold seeping through his jeans, he noticed something scratched into the stone of the fireplace. Faded letters, barely visible in the dim light. He leaned closer, squinting. This house built 1952 by J. Whitmore. For whoever needs a home. Vincent stared at the inscription. 70 years. This house had stood for 70 years. Through storms and neglect, and people who had given up on it, and it was still standing. Outside, the wind picked up. The first snowflake drifted through the hole in the roof and landed on Vincent's knee. It melted immediately, a small, cold dot spreading into his jeans. More would follow, thousands more, and he had exactly 1 night to figure out how to survive them. The first board slipped out of Vincent's frozen fingers and clattered down the roof, spinning off the edge and landing in the weeds below. He climbed down, retrieved it, climbed back up. His sneakers scraped against the old shingles, some crumbling under his weight like stale crackers. The pitch of the roof wasn't steep, but his legs shook from hunger and cold, and every movement felt like a negotiation with gravity. The hole nearest the chimney was the biggest, almost 2 feet across, the edges black and soft where water had rotted through. Vincent positioned the board over it, holding it in place with one hand while reaching for a nail with the other. He'd found the nails at the town dump that morning, a coffee can full of them, most bent or rusted, but some still usable. The hammer had cost him a full day of splitting firewood for a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd watched him work from her kitchen window without offering water or asking his age. In a small town, an extra pair of hands was an extra pair of hands. The first nail went in crooked. Vincent tried to straighten it with the claw end, but the head snapped off, leaving a useless stub embedded in the wood. He pulled out another nail, positioned it, swung. The hammer's loose handle wobbled on impact, throwing off his aim. The nail bent, the board shifted. Vincent grabbed for it, his palm scraping across the rough surface. A splinter drove deep into the meat below his thumb. He didn't make a sound, just looked at his hand, the thin line of blood welling up around the wood fragment, and kept working. By midday, he'd patched the first hole. It wasn't pretty. The board sat crooked, gaps visible where it didn't quite meet the surrounding shingles. But when he poured water from his bottle over it, most of the liquid ran off instead of dripping through. Most, not all, but most. He climbed down for more boards. The town dump yielded treasures if you knew how to look. Vincent walked the perimeter at dawn before the trucks came, picking through what others had thrown away. Wood pallets, missing slats, a bucket with a crack in the bottom, rope that had been cut short but could still tie things together. He dragged what he could back to the house, making 3 trips before his arms refused to lift anymore. The second hole took longer. The wood around it was softer, and his first nail pushed straight through without catching anything solid. He had to find the beam underneath, pressing with his fingers until he felt resistance and aim for that instead. Swing. Miss. The hammer glanced off and caught his left knuckle. Pain flared up his wrist. Vincent sat back, cradling his hand against his chest, breathing through his teeth. The knuckle was already swelling. The skin split in a thin red line. He tore a strip from the bottom of his shirt. It was ruined anyway, stained with sweat and dirt and vegetable juice from the market. He wrapped his hand tight, flexing his fingers to make sure they still worked. They did. Barely. He picked up the hammer and kept going. Days passed like this. A week, then 2, then 3. Wake before dawn. Work until the light faded. Sleep on the floor in the corner, farthest from the leaks. His jacket pulled over his head like a hood. Food came from trading. Vincent learned who would bargain and who wouldn't. Mr. Hensley at the feed store would give him a day-old sandwich in exchange for sweeping the stockroom. The widow on Maple Street paid half a loaf of bread for carrying her groceries home. The man at the gas station let him fill his water bottle from the outdoor spigot without asking questions. Nobody was generous, but some people were fair. That was enough. His hands became a map of the work, blisters on both palms from the hammer, splinters embedded so deep he couldn't get them out, cuts from rusty nails and sharp edges of broken wood. The skin cracked and bled in the dry cold. And he learned to keep them moving because if he let them rest too long, the stiffness made them useless. On the 18th day, a nail caught the fleshy part of his palm between thumb and forefinger. Vincent looked down. Blood welled around the metal, bright red, against his dirty skin. Not deep enough to go through, he'd pulled back just in time, but deep enough to make gripping the hammer difficult for the next week. He cleaned it with water he'd boiled over the stove, wrapped it with a clean strip of cloth he'd traded 2 hours of work for, and checked it every morning for the red streaks that would mean infection. The streaks never came. He picked up another nail, positioned it, swung. The board held. By the end of the first month, the roof had stopped dripping onto his sleeping spot. Water still seeped through in 2 places, the corners where his patches didn't quite overlap, but the main holes were covered. When he lay on the floor at night, he could look up and see wood instead of sky. The walls were harder. He stuffed the biggest gaps with the old newspaper and mud, mixing them together into a paste that dried hard and gray. It wasn't insulation, but it slowed the wind. The cast iron stove was his biggest victory. An old man outside the general store had told him how to check the flue, reach up inside with a long stick, and make sure nothing was blocking it. Birds' nests, dead leaves, the corpses of squirrels who had crawled in looking for warmth and never crawled out. Vincent had pulled out a mess of dried grass and feathers, a rusted tin can, and something that might have once been a rat. The smell made his eyes water, but when he built a small fire from twigs and newspaper, the smoke rose straight up. The flue worked. That night, for the first time, he slept without shivering. Not comfortable, not safe. The floor was hard, and every noise outside made him jerk awake. Wind, animals, the settling of old wood. His injured hand throbbed when the temperature dropped, but he slept more than 2 hours at a stretch, which hadn't happened since before his parents died. He woke to gray light filtering through the remaining gaps. His hands ached in 3 different places. The fire had gone out sometime in the night, and his breath made small clouds in the cold air. But the roof held, and somewhere outside, through the wall he'd patched with mud and newspaper, he heard footsteps. Vincent sat up slowly. The footsteps stopped, right outside his door. Then nothing. Just silence and the sound of his own breathing. He waited. 1 minute. 2. The footsteps started again, slower this time, circling the house, like someone was looking for something. Or someone. Vincent held his breath. The shadow shifted across the gap where the window used to be, smaller than he'd first thought, lower to the ground. A cat! It jumped onto the windowsill, a scrawny orange thing with torn ears and matted fur. It looked at Vincent for a long moment, yellow eyes catching the weak light from the stove. Then it dropped back down and disappeared into the weeds. Vincent let the hammer fall to his side. His hands were shaking from cold, from the sudden spike of fear, from the hunger that never quite left anymore. Just a cat, just a stray, like him, looking for somewhere warm. He laughed. It came out rough, unfamiliar. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed at anything. 5 weeks had passed since he'd bought the house. 5 weeks of patching and fixing and trading his labor for scraps. The roof held now, not perfectly, but enough. The walls kept out most of the wind, and the stove, after days of scraping rust and clearing the flue, finally drew properly. This morning, Vincent built his first real fire, not the small, smoky attempts from before twigs and newspaper that burned fast and gave nothing back. This was a proper fire. Split wood he'd earned by clearing fallen branches from old Mr. Hensley's backlot for 3 days straight. Kindling arranged the way the man at the hardware store had grudgingly shown him after Vincent swept his floors for a week. The flames caught, spread. The iron belly of the stove began to tick and ping as it heated. Sounds Vincent had never heard before, but somehow recognized. The sounds a house made when it was coming alive. Warmth spread through the room in slow waves. Vincent sat on the floor near the stove, close enough to feel the heat on his face, and watched the snow fall through the window. It had started in the night light flurries at first, then heavier. By morning, 4 inches covered the ground. The roof above him creaked under the weight, but held firm. No leaks, no drips, just the soft sound of snow settling on wood that had been patched with nothing but determination and whatever he could scavenge. He'd done that. He'd made this shelter with his own bleeding hands. Vincent looked down at those hands now. The cuts were healing, leaving thin white scars across his palms and fingers. The wound between his thumb and forefinger had closed clean, no infection. Just a red line that would fade with time. His nails were cracked and dirty, black lines embedded in the creases that wouldn't wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. They didn't look like a 14-year-old's hands anymore. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his meal, 3 small potatoes, payment for 2 days of mucking out chicken coops for the widow on Oak Street. The smell of manure still clung to his clothes, sharp and ammonia sour. But he'd stopped noticing. Vincent set the potatoes on top of the stove. The skins began to darken almost immediately, crackling in the heat. He turned them with a stick, careful not to burn himself, watching the steam rise. When they were soft enough, he picked one up with the edge of his sleeve and bit into it. The inside was hot and mealy, almost tasteless, without salt or butter. It burned his tongue. He didn't care. He was eating a hot meal in his own house with heat from a fire he'd built himself. The second potato went down faster. The third he made himself slow down, chewing each bite, feeling the warmth spread through his stomach. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the stove kept burning. Vincent leaned back against the wall solid now, packed with mud and newspaper and scraps of cloth, and looked around the room. It was ugly. Mismatched boards on the ceiling, gaps still visible where his patches didn't quite meet. The floor was bare wood, splintered in places, soft with rot in the far corner. The door hung better than before, but still scraped when it opened. Still scraped. But it was warm, and it was standing, and he had made it that way. For the first time in months since before the accident, before the funeral, before his uncle's door closed in his face, the voice in his head went quiet, the one that whispered he was worthless, useless, a burden. It was still there, somewhere, but today he couldn't hear it. A movement outside caught his eye, through the window. Beyond the falling snow, a figure walked along the road. Vincent recognized him, the man from the grocery store, The one who'd laughed when Vincent bought the house, who'd said he'd need luck. The man stopped, turned toward the house. Vincent watched him look at the chimney, where smoke curled up into the gray sky, at the patched roof, at the door that hung straight now instead of crooked. He waited for the laugh, the shake of the head, the dismissive wave. It didn't come. The man just looked for a long moment. Then he turned and kept walking, his footprints filling slowly with fresh snow. He hadn't laughed. That was something. Night came early, the way it did in winter. Vincent fed the stove with smaller pieces to make the wood last through the darkness. He'd learned to ration, learned that everything had a limit. Everything ran out. Everything needed to be measured and planned. He lay down on the floor near the stove, his jacket rolled under his head, and watched the firelight flicker across the ceiling. His eyes grew heavy. His body, exhausted from weeks of work and hunger, pulled him toward sleep. The stove ticked. The wind hummed against the walls. Somewhere outside, an owl called once and went silent. Vincent slept. He woke in the dark to a sound. Not the wind, not an animal. Something else. Footsteps. Outside, crunching through the snow. Vincent's eyes opened. He lay still, barely breathing. The footsteps circled the house slowly, deliberate. A person walking the perimeter, stopping at each wall, each window. Vincent's hand found the hammer beside him. He didn't move. The footsteps stopped at the door. He heard breathing, ragged, uneven, like someone who had walked a long way in the cold. He waited for a knock, for a shout, for something, but the footsteps started again, moving away now, slower, fading into the night. Vincent didn't sleep again. He lay there until dawn, watching the door, listening for the sound to return. It never did. When gray light crept through the window, he stood and opened the door. Fresh snow covered everything smooth and white, unmarked except for one set of footprints. They led from the road to his house, circled it once, then continued past, heading toward the edge of town, toward the woods, toward nothing. Vincent followed them with his eyes until they disappeared into the tree line. Someone had come. Someone had stood outside his door in the middle of a winter night, listening to the fire crackle, watching the smoke rise, and they had walked away. The wind hit the house like a fist. Vincent woke to the sound of it, a low, constant howl that found every gap in his patches and pushed through. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting weak orange light across the floor. Outside, the night had turned vicious. He fed the stove with shaking hands. 3 logs, his supply for the next 2 days, gone in one feeding, but the temperature had dropped so fast he could see his breath even with the fire burning. The coldest night yet. He'd heard people in town talking about it yesterday, a storm coming down from Canada. The kind that killed livestock and froze pipes. "Stay inside," the woman at the general store had said to the customer ahead of him. "This one's a killer." Vincent had no radio, no way to know when it would end. He could only wait. The wind screamed. The walls shook. Somewhere in the roof, a board he'd nailed down began to rattle, pulling against its fastening with each gust. Then he heard it. Not the wind, something else. A sound at the door. Soft, weak, like someone knocking with the last of their strength. Vincent stood. The floor was ice through his socks. He crossed to the door and pressed his ear against the wood, listening. The sound came again. 3 slow taps, then nothing. He grabbed the hammer, his only weapon, and pulled the door open. The wind nearly knocked him back. Snow swirled in, stinging his face, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, he looked down. A man lay crumpled on the porch. Old, 70 at least. His clothes were thin, a jacket that might have been warm once, pants worn through at the knees. His hair was white and wild, plastered to his skull with ice. His lips had turned the color of bruises. The man's eyes opened, pale blue, nearly colorless in the dim light from the stove. They looked up at Vincent, without pleading, without desperation. Just looked. The way a man looks when he's stopped expecting anything from anyone. Vincent recognized those eyes. He'd seen them in the window of the hardware store, reflected back at him 2 months ago. The same emptiness, the same resignation. The eyes of someone who had already been told no and knew they would be told no again. This was the one who'd left footprints in the snow, who'd circled the house and walked away, who'd stood outside in the dark, watching the smoke rise from the chimney, and hadn't knocked until tonight, when not knocking meant dying. Vincent looked at the man, then looked back at his house, his shelter, his 4 walls, his small fire. The wood stacked by the stove would last 3 days, maybe 4, if he rationed carefully. The food was worse. 4 potatoes, a handful of dried beans he'd traded for last week. Enough for 1 person, stretched thin, not enough for 2. The math was simple. If he let this man in, they would share everything. The warmth would spread thinner. The food would run out faster. And when the storm ended, if it ended, one of them might be dead anyway. He could close the door. The man would understand. Anyone would understand. In weather like this, you saved yourself first. That was how the world worked. The wind howled. Snow blew across the porch, covering the man's legs in white. Vincent's hand tightened on the doorframe. He remembered standing outside his uncle's house. The click of the lock, the shadow moving away from the window, the cold settling into his bones while he waited for someone to change their mind. No one had. He remembered the woman at the market, turning her back, the hardware store owner closing the door. All the faces that had looked through him like he wasn't there. The man on the porch wasn't looking through him. He was looking at him, waiting. Not for mercy, his eyes were past that. Just waiting to see what Vincent would do. And Vincent realized something. This was where he found out who he was. He could be like everyone else. Close the door. Protect what he had. Survive, or he could be the person he'd wished someone had been for him. Come in. 2 words. They came out rough, barely audible over the wind. But the old man heard them. He tried to stand. His legs wouldn't hold. Vincent grabbed his arm thin, the bones sharp under the skin, and pulled. The man weighed almost nothing. When had he last eaten? Vincent half carried, half dragged him through the door, kicked it shut against the wind. The sudden silence felt like pressure in his ears. He lowered the man to the floor near the stove. The old man's shivering was violent, uncontrollable, his whole body shaking like something was trying to escape from inside him. His fingers were white at the tips. Early frostbite. Maybe Vincent had seen pictures in a book once. If it wasn't too deep, the fingers might be saved. He grabbed his jacket, his only jacket, and spread it over the man's chest. Then the blanket he'd traded 2 days of work for. The one that kept him from freezing at night. He piled everything he had atop of the stranger. The man's eyes found his again. Why, the word came out cracked, barely a whisper. Vincent didn't answer. He didn't have words for it. Didn't have explanations that would make sense. Instead, he fed the stove again. Another log. Tomorrow's warmth. Spent tonight. The flames rose higher, throwing heat into the room. The old man's shivering began to slow. His breathing steadied. The color not much, but some crept back into his lips. Vincent sat against the wall across from him, watching. His own body was cold now without the jacket. The floor leached heat from him with every passing minute. He wrapped his arms around his knees and waited. Outside, the storm raged on. The walls shook. The wind screamed through gaps he hadn't managed to patch. But inside there were two people breathing, two hearts beating. The man's eyes closed. His chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm. Sleep, real sleep. Not the half-death of hypothermia. Vincent watched him for a long time. He'd just given away half of everything he had, maybe more. The wood would run out faster now. The food would need to be split. Every calculation he'd made about surviving the winter had just been cut in two. And sitting there in the cold, watching a stranger sleep by his fire. Vincent realized something else. He didn't regret it. He didn't understand why. He should regret it. He should be angry at himself for letting sentiment override survival. But when he'd looked into that old man's eyes, he'd seen something that made closing the door impossible. He'd seen himself standing outside his uncle's house, waiting for someone to care. Now someone had. Even if that someone was just a 14-year-old boy in a broken-down house, with nothing left to give. The fire crackled. The storm howled. The old man slept. And Vincent realized, sitting there in the cold, that he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time since his parents died, he had someone to keep alive. The old man's name was Harold. Vincent learned this on the second morning, when the storm had finally stopped and weak sunlight pushed through the gaps in the walls. Harold sat by the stove, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water. They had nothing else to put in it, and said his name like it was something he'd almost forgotten how to use. Harold Whitfield, 72 years old. He paused. Used to be somebody. His voice was rough, unused. The sound of a man who hadn't spoken to another person in a long time. Vincent divided the potatoes. 3 for Harold, 2 for himself. He didn't mention the math. Harold's eyes tracked the portions anyway. But he didn't argue. He just ate slowly, like a man who knew how to make food last. The woodpile shrank faster with 2 people. Vincent counted the logs each morning, calculating days. The stack that would have lasted him a week was down to 4 days. Maybe 5 if they let the fire burn lower at night. They let it burn lower. Vincent woke in the dark with his teeth chattering, the cold seeping up from the floor through his thin jacket. Across the room, Harold was awake too. Vincent could see his eyes reflecting the faint glow of dying embers. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. 2 weeks passed before Harold could stand without help. The frostbite on his fingers had been shallow enough, the tips were tender and red, but the flesh hadn't blackened. He would keep his hands. His feet were worse. Vincent had cut away the frozen socks that first night, peeling fabric from skin, and found toes that looked like wax. They were healing now, slowly. But Harold winced every time he put weight on them. On the 15th day, Harold started talking. It came out in pieces, like something that had been broken apart and was trying to remember how to fit together. He'd been a carpenter, had his own shop in a town 2 counties over, built furniture tables, chairs, cabinets. Good work, the kind people paid real money for. Had a wife, Margaret, 34 years. Harold stared at the stove. Cancer took her. Then it was just me and the kids. 2 sons, 1 daughter. Harold had raised them alone after Margaret died. Worked double shifts, missed meals so they could eat. Put them through school, one after another, taking whatever jobs he could find when the furniture orders dried up. They did good, college, careers, houses with lawns. His mouth twisted into something that wasn't a smile. I was proud. Thought I'd done something right. Then he got old. His hands started shaking. Couldn't hold tools steady anymore. The shop closed. The house went next. Sold to pay medical bills for a back surgery that didn't work. I moved in with my son, Robert. Harold's voice went flat. His wife didn't want me there. I could see it every time she looked at me, like I was furniture that didn't match her decorating. 6 months. That's how long it lasted. Then Robert sat him down and explained about the nursing home. Just temporary, he'd said. Until you're back on your feet. Harold laughed at that, a dry, bitter sound that turned into a cough. You know what a nursing home is. It's where they put people they want to forget about. They took my clothes, gave me a gown that tied in the back, put me in a room with a man who screamed at the walls all night. He stopped. His hands were shaking again, and not from the cold. They made me wear a diaper. I didn't need one. But it was easier for them, easier than Malcolm helping me to the bathroom. Vincent said nothing, just listened. My daughter came once, stood in the doorway, wouldn't come in because of the smell. Harold's jaw tightened. The smell was the man in the other bed, not me. But she didn't ask. She just stood there, holding her purse against her chest like she was afraid to touch anything. Talked about the weather for 5 minutes. Then she left. The fire crackled. Outside, snow was falling again, soft, steady. I asked the nurse to call Robert, begged her. Harold's voice dropped so low Vincent had to lean forward to hear. She said she did. Said he was busy. Said they'd come visit soon. They never came. The day Harold left, walked out the back door while the staff was changing shifts, no one tried to stop him. No one noticed until the next morning. They probably filed a report. Called someone. But who was going to look? His family didn't want him back. I went to Robert's house anyway. Knocked on the door. Harold's hands clenched around the empty cup. His wife answered, Looked at me like I was a stray dog who'd gotten into the garbage. Told me Robert wasn't home. Told me to go back where I belonged. He stood on that porch for an hour, waiting. The neighbors walked by, people who knew him, people whose furniture he'd built, whose broken chairs he'd fixed for nothing, because that's what neighbors did. They looked at him standing there in his thin coat and worn-out shoes, a 72-year-old man begging at his own son's door. Not one of them stopped. Robert came home, pulled into the driveway, saw me standing there. Harold's voice cracked. "You know what he did?" Vincent shook his head. "He walked right past me, into his house, and closed the door." The words hung in the air. "I've been walking since then. 3 weeks, maybe more. Lost count." Harold looked down at his hands, the same hands that had built furniture, raised children, held his dying wife. "I came here because I saw the smoke. Thought maybe whoever lived here would let me warm up before I kept going." Going where? Harold didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, the food ran out. Vincent looked at the last handful of dried potatoes, barely enough for one meal. Not enough for one person, let alone two. He held them in his palm, feeling their rough skin, their pitiful weight. He could eat them himself. Harold would understand. The man was old, weak, probably wouldn't survive the winter anyway. It would be practical, logical, the smart thing to do. Vincent picked up the potatoes. Then he reached across and set them in front of Harold. "Eat. Tomorrow I'll find something." Harold looked at the food, then at Vincent. His eyes were wet. "Why?" The word came out broken. "You don't even know me." Vincent didn't have an answer. Not one he could put into words. He just knew what it felt like to stand outside a closed door. And he knew he couldn't be the person who kept it shut. Harold ate, slowly. Tears ran down his face, disappearing into his beard. He didn't wipe them away, didn't try to hide them. When he finished, he sat for a long moment, staring at his empty hands. Then he looked up. "There's a place in the woods, mile or so north. Dead trees, fell in a storm a few years back. Dry wood, enough to last a month if we haul it." He paused. "And I know things. Plants you can eat when there's nothing else. My father taught me, back during the Depression." Vincent studied him. The man was still weak, still thin, but something in his eyes had changed. "You'd help?" Harold's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. "Kid, you just gave me the last food you had. Least I can do is make sure we don't starve." The next morning, Harold stood on his own. His feet still hurt. Vincent could see it in the way he winced with each step. But he stood. "Ready?" Vincent nodded. They opened the door together and stepped out into the snow. Harold knew where the dead trees were. A mile north, past the frozen creek bed. Through brush that grabbed at their clothes and snow that came up to their knees in places. Vincent followed him, watching the old man's back, ready to catch him if his damaged feet gave out. They didn't. Harold moved slowly but steadily, picking a path between the drifts like he'd walked these woods his whole life. Maybe he had. Maybe all those years of building furniture had taught him to read the land the same way he read wood grain. "Storm 3 years back," Harold said without turning around. "Took down a whole stand of oaks. County never sent anyone to clear them. too far from the road. The trees appeared through the bare branches ahead, a tangle of gray trunks lying across each other like bones. Some had broken apart on impact, exposing pale wood beneath the bark, dry wood, seasoned by 3 winters of wind and cold. Vincent touched one of the branches. It cracked under his fingers, clean and light. No dampness, no rot. They worked without speaking. Vincent dragged the smaller branches into a pile while Harold used a rusted saw he'd spotted in the crawl space under the house. Vincent had seen it weeks ago, but hadn't known what it was for. The old man's hand shook when he rested, but when he gripped the saw, they steadied. The sound of metal through wood was rhythmic, almost peaceful. By noon, they had more wood than Vincent could carry. They made 4 trips back to the house, piling the logs against the outside wall where the overhang kept them dry. The stack grew until it reached the window frame. "That's 5 weeks," Harold said, looking at the pile. His breath made clouds in the cold air. "Maybe 6, if we're careful with it." 6 weeks. Vincent had been counting in days. The idea of 6 weeks felt like something he couldn't quite hold in his mind. That night, they ate better. Harold had spotted something on the way to the trees, a patch of frozen cattails near the creek. He dug through the snow with his bare hands and pulled up the roots, thick and white and starchy. Boil them long enough. They taste almost like potatoes. They didn't taste like potatoes. They tasted like mud and fiber and something vaguely plant-like. But they filled the stomach, and that was enough. The days found a rhythm. Harold taught Vincent which bark you could chew when you had nothing else, the inner layer of certain pines, bitter but edible. How to find rabbit trails under the snow, the way certain birds flew when there was food nearby, follow them. And you might find a berry bush they'd missed, frozen fruit still clinging to the branches. "My father was a farmer," Harold explained one evening, his hands working to repair a hole in Vincent's jacket with thread pulled from an old blanket. "Depression hit when I was 8. We ate things that weren't food just to stay alive. You learn what the land gives you, or you die." Vincent watched Harold's fingers move, still skilled, still precise. Despite the tremors, the man had built furniture for 30 years. His hands remembered how to work even when the rest of him had forgotten why. The first 2 weeks after the storm were the hardest. The snares they set caught nothing. The cattail roots ran out. There were 3 days when they ate only boiled pine bark and melted snow. But they didn't stop. The house changed around them. Harold showed Vincent how to adjust the stove's damper to burn slower and hotter. The same wood lasted longer, and the heat spread more evenly. He found a way to seal the gaps around the doorframe using fat rendered from a rabbit. Vincent finally trapped in the 3rd week, mixed with ash to create a paste that hardened in the cold. They built a storage area in the corner, shelves from scrap wood, lined with dried grass for insulation, a place to keep what little food they had where mice couldn't reach it. Vincent added a second sleeping platform near the stove, just a raised frame of planks covered with dried leaves and the blanket. It kept Harold off the cold floor. The old man had started coughing at night, a wet sound that worried Vincent more than the hunger. By mid-February, the coughing had eased. They fell into routine. Wake at first light, check the fire, eat whatever they had, work on the house until dark, sleep, repeat. Vincent noticed something changing in Harold. The old man stood straighter now. His voice came easier. When he explained how to tie a proper knot or sharpen a blade on a stone, his eyes lost that dead quality they'd had the first night. He was useful again. Someone needed what he knew. And Vincent noticed something changing in himself too. The voice that whispered he was worthless. It was quieter now. Not gone, but quieter. He had someone to take care of. Someone who took care of him in return. The nights were still cold. The food was still scarce. But they were alive. And they were not alone. One evening, as the fire burned low and the darkness pressed against the windows, Harold looked around the room and made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You know what this place reminds me of?" Vincent shook his head. "My father's house. After the bank took the farm, we moved into a shack not much bigger than this. Whole family, 6 of us in one room." He paused. "I hated it then. Thought we'd lost everything." The fire crackled. "But we still had each other. That was the thing. We still had that." Vincent didn't say anything. He thought about his parents, the way his mother smelled like soap and coffee, the way his father hummed while he worked. Gone now. Nothing left but memories that hurt to touch. But Harold was here, real and breathing and alive. The knock came 3 weeks later. Vincent was alone by the stove. Harold had gone to check the snares he'd set near the tree line. The sound was soft at first, almost hesitant. 3 light taps on the door. Vincent froze. His hand found the hammer by instinct. Another knock, louder this time. He crossed to the door and opened it. An old woman stood on the porch, smaller than Harold, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather. Her face was lined and weathered, her hair white beneath a faded scarf. She carried nothing, no bag, no supplies, just herself. Her eyes were the same as Harold's had been that first night, empty, waiting. "I saw the smoke," she said. Her voice cracked on the words. "Someone in Milton, the town I passed through 2 days ago, they told me about a place that takes people in. People nobody wants." She stopped, swallowed. "I walked all night. I don't have anywhere else to go." And Vincent looked at her, then past her, toward the tree line where Harold was emerging from the woods, a rabbit hanging from his hand. The old man saw the woman on the porch. He stopped. His eyes met Vincent's across the snowy yard. No words. None were needed. Harold gave a single nod. Vincent stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in." The woman's eyes filled. She tried to speak. Couldn't. She walked past him into the warmth, her thin shoulders shaking. Harold arrived a few minutes later, stamping snow from his boots. He looked at the woman, huddled by the stove. Her frozen hands held toward the hand, and then at Vincent. "Guess we're 3 now," Vincent nodded. "We'll need more food. Then we'll find more." That night, they shared the rabbit 3 ways instead of 2. The woman's name was Ruth. She'd been a school teacher once, a grandmother. Now nobody's anything. Her son had moved to California and stopped calling. Her landlord had sold the building. She'd been sleeping in her car until someone stole it. She cried when she ate, not from sadness, from the simple shock of being warm and fed and not alone. The house creaked in the wind. The fire burned low, and somewhere outside Wishful, invisible against the gray sky, smoke rose from the chimney, visible for miles. A signal, a sign that someone was home. In the morning, when Vincent went outside to gather more wood, he saw something that made him stop. Footprints in the snow. Fresh ones, leading from the road toward the house. More than one set. Spring came slowly to the edge of town. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and mud beneath. The creek thawed and began to run again. A constant murmur through the trees. Birds returned, first one or two, then dozens, filling the mornings with sounds Vincent had almost forgotten existed. The house had changed. What had been one room was now 3 walls added through the winter, built from salvaged wood and whatever Harold could teach Vincent to construct. The old man had sketched the plans in dirt with a stick, calculating angles the way he'd done when he built furniture. Vincent had done the lifting. Ruth had filled the gaps with mud and cloth, her teacher's patience perfect for work that required repetition. They weren't alone anymore. An old man named Thomas had arrived in January, half frozen, following the smoke from the chimney. Ruth had heard about him from someone in town, another person the world had decided wasn't worth keeping. Then a woman named Grace in February, who'd walked 12 miles through a blizzard because someone in Milton had mentioned the place that takes people in. 5 of them now. 5 people in a house that had started as a pile of junk no one wanted. Vincent stood outside in the early morning light, looking at what they'd built. The garden beds Harold had planned. Dark soil turned and ready for the seeds Ruth had traded for in town. The chicken coop Thomas was constructing from scrap wood. They didn't have chickens yet, but he said they would by summer. The rain barrel Grace had rigged from an old drum, catching snow melt for the vegetable starts. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The sound of footsteps made him turn. A man was walking up the path from the road. 40-something. Work boots, heavy coat. His face was familiar. Vincent had seen it before, though it took him a moment to place where. The day he'd bought the house, this man had been walking past, had seen the handshake with Mr. Garrett, had laughed loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Good luck with that, son. You're gonna need it." That's what he'd said. Vincent remembered the sound of it, the dismissal in his voice. The man wasn't laughing now. He stopped a few feet from Vincent, his hands shoved in his coat pockets, his eyes not quite meeting Vincent's. He looked smaller than Vincent remembered, older. Something had happened to him since that day. Vincent could see it in the stoop of his shoulders, the way he stood like someone carrying weight that didn't show. "You're the kid." The man's voice was rough. "The one who bought this place." Vincent nodded. The man looked past him at the house, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at Thomas working on the chicken coop, at Ruth hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't know how to say. "I heard what you're doing here, taking people in. Old folks nobody wants." He stopped, swallowed hard. "My mother, she's 79. I don't have room. My wife, she says we can't." His voice broke. He looked at the ground. "I don't know what else to do." Vincent studied him, this man who had laughed, who had walked away without a second thought, who was now standing here, asking for help. he had no right to ask for. The old Vincent, the one who'd stood outside his uncle's door, who'd been invisible to the whole town, would have wanted to say something, would have wanted to remind this man of his laughter, his cruelty, his certainty that Vincent would fail. But that Vincent seemed very far away now. "What's her name?" The man looked up. His eyes were red. "Eleanor. Eleanor Marsh." Vincent stepped aside and held the door open. "Bring her tomorrow, before dark." The man stared at him. His mouth opened, closed. He looked like he wanted to say something else, an apology, maybe, or an explanation, something to acknowledge the weight of what was happening. Vincent didn't need it. "Tomorrow," he said again. The man nodded, turned, walked back toward the road. At the edge of the property, he stopped and looked back. "Thank you." 2 words, quiet, barely audible. Vincent watched him disappear down the path. That evening, they sat around the stove, all 5 of them, plus the warmth of the fire and the smell of rabbit stew that Grace had made from the morning's catch. The windows were dark, but the room was full of light. Harold sat closest to Vincent, mending a shirt with thread so fine it was almost invisible. His hands still shook sometimes, but less than before. "You know," he said without looking up, "when I first got here, I figured I was done, finished, just waiting for whatever came next." Vincent watched him work. "I spent my whole life building things for other people, furniture, houses, a family." Harold set down the needle. "Then I got all old, and nobody wanted what I had left to give. So I thought, what's the point?" He looked around the room, at the walls he'd helped design, at the shelves he'd built, at Ruth and Thomas and Grace, all of them here because someone had opened a door. "Then you let me in." His voice was steady. "And I found out I still had something to offer. Just needed someone who wanted it." Vincent didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about his parents, gone now, their faces fading a little more each month. He thought about his uncle's door closing, about the hardware store owner who'd asked whose kid he was, about all the people who'd looked through him like he was made of glass. "I know what it's like," he said finally, standing outside, hoping someone will let you in. Harold nodded slowly. "And now you're the one opening doors." The fire crackled. Outside, the spring wind moved through the trees, softer now than it had been in winter, warmer. Thomas was telling Ruth a story about something that had happened 40 years ago, and she was laughing a real laugh, surprised out of her like she'd forgotten she could make that sound. Harold leaned back in his chair. "You know what you've got here? It's not just a house anymore." Vincent looked at him. "It's proof." Harold's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. "Proof that things people throw away can still be worth something, that they can still matter." He gestured at the room, at all of them. "Look at us, a bunch of nobodies, living in a place nobody wanted." He paused, listened to Ruth's laughter, to the pop of the fire, to the wind against the walls. "And now people are knocking on the door." Vincent looked toward the window. The road was empty now, but tomorrow it wouldn't be. Tomorrow there would be Eleanor Marsh, 79 years old, with nowhere else to go. And the day after that, maybe someone else. He didn't know what the future held, Didn't know if they'd make it through next winter or the one after that. Didn't know how many more people would find their way here, following the smoke, looking for a door that might open. But he knew one thing. He wasn't the boy who'd been thrown away anymore. He was the one who opened doors. The fire burned low, the room grew quiet, and somewhere outside, invisible in the darkness, the chimney sent smoke rising into the spring sky, a signal to anyone who needed to find their way home.